Hello, everybody. So I wanted to do a post-mortem of my trip from Hanoi, Vietnam, which was my first time coming to Vietnam, and give you some of my thoughts if you're thinking about going there yourself. So just give you a bit of context for this video before I get into it. Right now it is about the fall of 2022. Current situation, we are kind of in endemic sort of mode with the pandemic, and I am a Canadian that lives in Toronto, Canada, so that gives you a bit of an idea from a cultural perspective as well as weather perspective, all those type of things that I'm used to. So as I mentioned, first time I ever went to Vietnam, and I went to Hanoi, and my overall impressions of it, it was cool. People were very nice. I did have some challenges with infrastructure not being as developed as compared to, say, a place like Thailand. Weather was a little bit too humid at times, especially coming from a Canadian perspective where it tends to be a lot more cool, and even our hot summers, which do get hot, don't get quite that hot and that humid. So yeah, let me get into it. So in terms of entry, the entry was actually pretty easy compared to some other countries in terms of the COVID rules. Pretty much just have to get your visa done, but there was no testing requirements to get onto the plane, no arrival tests, so it was actually, that was one of the nice things. It was actually really much easier just to enter and to exit, and that definitely in this sort of endemic stage made things a lot easier. So upon arriving there, definitely you feel the heat, and I had actually arrived when the rainy season had started. So the first couple of days were actually really hot and humid, and then it rained almost every day. So I had to carry an umbrella most of the time where I was going. But the rain was intermittent, but it was pretty much for the course of a couple of weeks, pretty much raining every single day. So yeah, it is really hot and humid, and people would tell me about it, my friends would tell me about it, but obviously when you go there and experience it, it's a different thing. And in contrast to Canada, say Toronto, Canada, which most of the time is cool, and most people are actually surprised that we do actually have hot summers, but it's hot during the day, in a hot summer day, but during the nighttime it's actually quite cool, where you don't get that with Hanoi. It's actually hot during the night, hot and sticky. A lot of times my hair felt really just moist a lot of times. So a lot of times I actually end up going out just during the night, and during the day I'd just be busy with work and stuff like that, because it's still hot enough. So it's almost like a vampire going out at nighttime. In terms of people were really friendly, especially coming from a foreigner perspective. People were really curious about my life. A lot of people I met was through the dance scene, so there was a lot of good venues for dancing actually, for things like salsa and bachata and zouk, and so that was a good way to sort of connect with community. There wasn't too many other ways to meet new people. Like, for instance, they didn't have that much of an established meetup. For instance, meetup.com is a great place to meet new people whenever I'm in a new city. They did have a language exchange, but the format of that I found it a little bit difficult to meet people. Mind you, I don't speak any Vietnamese, so obviously that would help, and a lot of people are not necessarily comfortable with English, but a lot of times when I talk to people even off the street, they were really super willing to help me. They pull out their phone app and use Google Translate to communicate and things like that. So the other thing is, I was actually expecting, being hot, you do have your relief points like going to the mall and things like that. And so they did have a couple malls, which by Toronto, Canada standards, were a little bit small, and there wasn't that many people actually in the mall, which was a bit of a surprise. Wasn't that densely populated, but I guess the wealth gap there is so big that maybe some people can't afford to buy things at that respective mall. So things like that, just like coming to Canada and just having more of a mall culture, and yes, it's cold, but we have our relief spots in the mall, or yes, when it gets hot, you have your relief spot, but that wasn't there. So on the topic of affordability, that was one of the nice things. Everything was super cheap. Food was cheap. Everything was, even the apartment I got a pretty good deal for a good amount of space. So that's kind of also one of the reasons why I actually went to Vietnam, because I was researching how it is economically one of the biggest up and coming places, and trying to look ahead, like compared to places like Thailand, which are very touristy. This was not touristy at all. Try to look ahead of the curve as to what will be the up and coming places to get a lot of value. So so definitely you get a lot of value for your dollar. Having said that, the infrastructure is not quite there yet. One of the things that just drove me crazy was that, and I know it's a bit of a first world luxury, and you get to realize that when you go outside there, it's just having a sidewalk, right? When I came back to Canada, I loved the value of having a sidewalk, and because it was raining a lot of times my shoes would get dirty, and you don't have a proper amount of road to walk upon, and of course there's motorbikes all over the place, which didn't bother me so much in terms of like crossing the street. People always talk about the crossing the street being a bit chaotic, which it is, but that didn't bother me. That was something that I knew to expect that, and eventually I got the technique down in terms of crossing the street, where you take your look, but then you just walk. You don't stop, because that's where accidents happen, and I almost got an accident my second day. So things like crossing the street and not having that infrastructure, that didn't bother me, but definitely not having a sidewalk drove me crazy, because I like to walk a lot, especially because that way it allows me to see the city and discover new points. So it wasn't a city for a great walking culture. Actually, I think I was one of the few people that was walking. Most time you see people on their motorbikes, and a friend of mine told me, basically the expectation of a sidewalk and people walking all the time, that's kind of inside joke that they know that's usually only foreigners do that, right? So it's fine. You have to, when you go to another place, you have to remove your cultural bias, and I know it's I have some of those things, and some of those things are luxuries, especially like coming from Canada, which is a well-off country, and you give and take in certain areas. Like I said, Canada is cold, and Vietnam might be the opposite at times, and even sometimes the people can be a little bit cold, and even though we're known to be warm, but it's a layer of sort of of niceness that you don't really get beyond. Whereas people in Vietnam, I found, were a lot more sincere about that. Again, maybe just because I'm a foreigner, I'm not getting this sort of true treatment. I was staying by an area called the West Lake, which is considered to be one of the more sort of nicer, peaceful areas, and that was nice. But having to get to most of my activities, again, it took me about an hour's walk. So the best form of transportation is actually taking a Grab, which you can either get a motorbike or a car, which, depending on which time of day, it's pretty cheap to get around. But again, I still prefer to walk, but there is a certain point where I'm walking on the same route over and over to get to some of my activities throughout the week, because so it's kind of pointless, right? And when I travel, I try not to do too many touristy things, because when I travel, I basically want to go from the perspective of understanding what is it like to live there, and talk with the locals, meet with local people, and make friends there, and do the sort of day-to-day activities, like what would I do for fun and all those type of things, because I don't really feel like the tourist attractions are really a real representative of what it's like to live there. Just like I would say the same with Canada, Toronto, and a lot of people come here. They go to CN Tower. They go to they go to the Niagara Falls and things like that, which is great. To see those things as unique things in Toronto, but really the average Torontonian, that's not really our day-to-day life, right? So that would be sort of, I guess, a different in perspective, right? So yeah, I think overall it was really a good trip, and I think the biggest challenge people would have is the whole crossing the street thing. Again, for me, it didn't bother me that much. Actually, even the noise from all the traffic didn't really bother me, especially where my apartment was actually sort of away from the main road. So a lot of times when I'm at home and I'd sleep, I didn't even notice anything. And there's also a lot of cool French architecture from colonial times, which is really unique to see. But yeah, it was overall a good trip. Sometimes, of course, I had my moments, like I said, just not getting over not having a sidewalk, and dealing with that sort of first world spoiledness, which I've been accustomed to, and definitely made me a lot more gracious when I came back to Canada. Would I go back? Absolutely. I think I would like to try Ho Chi Minh City next time. I hear that would be a bit of a different experience. It's a little bit more faster pace, because it definitely, I know I did, even though there's a lot of traffic and things like that, it did seem pretty slow paced, and things were more at a relaxed pace, and I want to have a different experience and see what it's like. But just the logistics of getting around in terms of the activities I were always attending, that was a little bit more of a challenge. So yeah, I think if you're thinking of going to Hanoi, like most things, you have to just temper your expectations and take off your sort of your expectations and goggles and of from where you're from, and remove your biases, and to have a good time, right? So definitely it was an interesting place. I would go back. I do want to explore more of Vietnam, which I'll probably do so, coupling up with a trip to other places in Southeast Asia. So yeah, that's my 2 cents, sorry.